Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first Wisdom Wednesday as part of the Charlotte Center. We are so glad to see this many people here. This is a great group. I'm Kristen Eshelman. In my full-time, I lead innovation at Davidson College. And at the center, I lead our SenseMaker series. But today, I'm going to be the moderator for this event. And I'm delighted now to introduce our host, Angela Gala. Angela is a partner at Rogers and Gala Creative Partners and is also co-founder of Youth Meditation. Here at the center, she is our director of events. Angela, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kristen. Hello and welcome to Wisdom Wednesdays. Try saying that 3 times fast, but you can't. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Angela Gala, and I am with the Charlotte Center for the Humanities and Civic Imagination, the Charlotte Center for short. I was going to begin our conversation today with a verse about truth, but instead I chose the following quote. The search is what everyone would undertake if he were not stuck in the everydayness of his own life. To be aware of the possibility of the search is to be on to something. Not to be on to something is to be in despair. Walker Percy, the moviegoer. Wisdom Wednesdays is a series of conversations between us. It is us being on to something. I'd like to take a moment to thank Ortho Carolina for making this conversation series possible. Thank you so much for your investment in our community. Now, when Mark Paris, founder of the Charlotte Center, voluntold me that I would be hosting these conversations, I had to conceal my excitement for fear that he would take it away from me. These are the types of conversations I wanted to have in school, but they weren't welcome and I wasn't confident enough to push on that. So I went to school, I crammed the grades, went to college, got out, got a job. That was all education meant to me then. But somewhere in my 30s, I woke up and prompted by a business meeting, I read Ayn Rand and then turned to Tolstoy and then Emerson and then Whitman and then Hemingway, and I never stopped. And I have books shoved under every piece of furniture in my home because I can't seem to let them go. They've become my friends. And these types of conversations were now becoming a big part of my life. And what I've discovered is that they are imperative. The questions that most of us ask of ourselves, who am I? Why am I here? Were never connected to education for me. But I did find them connected in literature, art, poetry, and philosophy, which is why I am so proud to be a part of this organization at the Charlotte Center. We are a community forum and civic action catalyst that invites people into meaningful connection and problem solving, informed by deep consideration of the human experience. Our mission is to inspire and equip citizens to engage in enlightened civic action. So, you never know how these conversations are going to go. And with Robert, rabbit holes abound, which is one of the reasons why I love them so much. If at any time you want to jump in, even if it's about something we touched on 5 minutes ago, please let Kristen know and she will get you in there. This is a conversation with you. So without further delay, I want to welcome my friend, Dr. Robert Corbin. The only way I know to introduce Robert is to give you my experience of him. And if I had to sum it up in one word, that word would be generative. Robert, thank you so much for being our guinea pig today. I am so grateful.
It is a privilege and an honor to be here with you, Angela. And oh my gosh, I've already gone down so many rabbit holes as a consequence of that great introduction. So I'm ready to go when you are.
Awesome. Well, so you are the International Educational Consultant for Discovery Education. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do and how you got there?
Yes, 100%. So it's privileged work. Like many of you, you can probably imagine my work has shifted significantly since March 2020. I was on 160 flights in the prior year. My job is essentially to interface with ministers of education, what we call channel partners and leaders all over the world, to imagine what is possible on behalf primarily of teachers and students, but also in societies, because as we all know well, what we choose to do in terms of educational circles is a reflection if not society and community itself, to, bring in Dewey. Education and community are one and the same. So I also am pretty deeply involved as a consequence of my excellent education at UNCC in measurement and evaluation. I do a lot of thinking about what the work that we are doing means, right? At the end of the day, that's an important question, by the way, I think we all have to ask is, what are people empowered to do as a consequence of the work that we do with them? If we can't answer that question, it becomes a pretty hollow enterprise, doesn't it? Like, why am I doing this work? So that is a long-winded answer. Get used to those, friends. Thank you.
That was fabulous. In our last conversation, we naturally came to the topic of uncovering truth. And I think still go ahead, I'm sorry. You have a thought on that?
Absolutely fine. And, can you think, Angela, I don't want to preempt your question, but I can't
No.
think of a more important topic in February 2021 than to help people to imagine what is likely to be true. Not imagine, but to derive what is likely to be true. But anyway, sorry to disrupt. Go ahead. What was your question?
No, you were going right down that road. I guess I was still left with, and I'm sure we'll answer it, but I think pondering this question and chewing it up is important. How do we recognize truth when we encounter it? And how do we get there? I mean, there has to be a motivation to want to get there, right? We have to be motivated to want to know what the truth is versus, oh yeah, that's exactly what I think too, so I'm going to agree with that, right? And so how do we recognize it, and how do we go about getting there?
That is such a salient question. So I just have to say, I'm gonna engage in a little bit of lamenting. I hope you will all indulge me. So ever since we gave up our personal data after 9/11, we have been in echo chambers, in my opinion. So when you give up your personal data, what ends up happening is now those that gather your personal data can tailor their messages and their communication to you. There's this wonderful documentary many of you probably have seen called The Social Dilemma, where you find yourself in echo chambers where the majority of people, I think, don't even realize that when you do a Google search, for example, you're going to get results that are based on your prior behavior in the use of media. So it's a really important question. How do we derive truth? And the challenge, of course, is, in my opinion, we don't really teach people to be comfortable with ambiguity. Your précis to this conversation is very important because you said you essentially went through your K-12 education and then your undergraduate education where perhaps you didn't really focus on that productive discomfort, right? That cognitive dissonance that would allow you to want to go in. So I just happen to think, again, this is a consequence of my excellent education at UNCC, and I have to call Dr. Bosley, amazing teacher in terms of the importance of narratives in how it is that we engage in truth and with others. I can ask this question just very quickly. This is a sidebar, but when was the last time that you teared up as a consequence of reading a scientific journal? Right? You didn't.
I was going to say, I'm sorry, that never happened. When's the last time I read a scientific journal? I'm not sure.
Right. So, I wasn't this morning sitting in my kitchen table and I had to call my wife over because I was tearing up. What I get emotional about are compelling narratives, compelling stories, a beautiful piece of art, seeing people treat one another with empathy. Those are all important considerations. So, if you will, I'd love to just say very quickly, I think that truth is derived through triangulation. I'd love to, can I just engage in an exercise very quickly?
Please.
I'd love to do this exercise very quickly. And I'd love to hear voices. I'd love to hear your participation. So I'm going to show you two cylinders. This one we'll call the lengthwise cylinder. And this one we'll call the widthwise cylinder, right? It's a cylinder essentially made from the same piece of paper. Go ahead and turn on your voices and turn on your mics and tell me, if I were to put masking tape on the bottom and fill it up with rice, which one would contain the greater volume of rice? Which cylinder would contain the greater volume of rice? And I will give adequate wait time too, because that's excellent teaching. So Angela and I will wait here until we hear voices. So what do you all think? Don't be embarrassed, by the way, if you don't know. It's okay.
I already got it wrong just for all of you. So
Same
Same.
amount.
Beth says the same. Well,
With.
let's hear from everybody. Deborah and
Same.
Tim and Ty, what do you all think?
I'd say the
Same.
same.
Yes. Okay.
Same.
So what's the obvious reasoning behind why they have to be the same?
Same volume of the paper is the same size no matter how you fold it.
Yeah, 8.5 by 11 is the same as 11 by 8.5. So in our country, would a K-5 student know this answer? What do you think?
No.
Probably not. What about 612?
Hope so.
Yeah,
No.
maybe. And then certainly by the time you get to become an undergraduate, you would know that. Okay, so what about a bunch of nerds gathered together on a Wednesday at noon? Would they know the answer?
It's not.
By the way, I don't use the word nerd as a pejorative. I use it as a compliment. I am so excited. You know, I'm hearkening back to what I learned about the Greek agora and polis. I wish we could get together and have discourse more often. It's really important. All right, so guess what? I have bad news for you. They're not the same. So the more important question is not, are those cylinders the same? The more important question, I think, is why don't we know that they're not the same? So I'd love to hear anybody's thoughts. Why do you think we don't know they're not the same?
I didn't pay attention in math class.
Yeah, that's a great. All right, so let me see if I can help with this question. How many of you can raise your hands on the camera. How many of you went through a math course or a science course or any course where the teacher said something like this? Hey, we're going to have a test on the volume of irregular solids Friday. So I need you to memorize the formula for a cylinder. Raise your hand if you ever had that experience. Yeah. No context whatsoever. And you probably heard Ben Stein's voice in the background too, right? You probably Bueller. And then so you studied for that, and then you went in the next morning and you took the test. And the moment you walked out the door, it was 100% outside of your mind. And so it wouldn't be inquiry if I told you the answer, but I will tell you. By the way, do you think that Star-Kissed tuna and Campbell soup are just crazy people and they like to create cans of various sizes? Or do you think there actually might be reasoning like you can maximize the volume of the contents while minimizing the quantity of materials used? So there's actually a very pragmatic application. So it turns out that the formula for a cylinder, as you recall, is pi r squared times height, with r being the distance from the center of the circle to the edge. Well, you can see clearly that this circle is a different radius from this circle. And then you guys are astute, so you're probably saying, yeah, that's true, but you created a longer paper. Well, guess what? Pi r squared times height is the formula. So that radius is a squared term. So all of this is to say, truth is derived quantitatively, qualitatively, and anecdotally. If you can point only to one of those, I am very, very highly skeptical. That's a scientific disposition. It's really a disposition about knowledge. So the point being context. We have to engage in a conversation with people first through empathy and context. I'll stop there. I'm nattering on like a professor as usual, so I'll stop.
No, you're not nathering, because one of the things that you said was knowledge. Now, when we talk about this past year that we've experienced, we all can't have enough knowledge to discern that what we're hearing is truth. And when you talk about triangulation, a lot of my dad and I would have these conversations. I'm like, Dad, you can't just watch Fox News. Man, you got to watch a lot of things. You got to read a lot of different, and when you talk about listening with empathy, you can kind of see my dad and I probably do not have the same political views. But when I hear him out all the way, and then I offer him my view, somehow we're still able to get along. And we don't fight about it. There's no friction. So to your point, those things are really important. And I can actually hear him when I'm not busy resisting him.
That's fantastic. There are some chats in the some comments in the chat too about relativism, which is a great comment, and then also the importance of direct experience. So several thoughts. First of all, bravo that you can have a civil conversation with your father. Bravo. I mean, it's embarrassing to say that in 2021, but that's really, really important. So I think about the book that Thomas Kuhn wrote back in 1962, Scientific Revolutions, where he talks about being open to a new paradigm. That's really, really important. That's a scientific habit of mind. We may be convinced that we have derived truth, but what he teaches us, in my opinion, is the door is always open for skepticism, and the door is always open for another explanation. The problem in our current culture, in my opinion, again, is there's this other wonderful book called Present Shock that was written by Rushkoff. Some of you may be old enough to remember Future Shock. Present Shock, one of the premises of this book is, thinking about time. We all have these devices, right? We all have these devices where some of us feel like we are immediately responsible to respond to others immediately. We also feel like we can get information right now, all the time. And so what Rushkoff writes about is this idea that we have, particularly among youth, unfortunately, we have intolerance for distant narratives. So we have become so acutely focused on our own worlds and our own arenas as a consequence of being in this machine learning world that we are unable to hear the narratives of others. It's really important, and it makes me very, very sad, right? So when I teach kids, and for me, kids is anybody that's under 30 years of age, they don't have tolerance for distant narrative. They don't want to hear about the history of art or the history of music or the history of philosophy. They want to know how the narrative connects to them right now. I want to give you an example of this. So when I was vice president of Discovery Place, I helped to bring this event, where adults would come into the museum in the evening. We realized, oh my gosh, teachers and adults, they always bring their kids, but they don't get to enjoy the museum themselves. So we did Science on the Rocks, right? Where you could consume alcohol and you could have an adult event and bring a date. One of the really cool things we do is we would do liquid nitrogen mimosas and liquid nitrogen wine slushies. And it was amazing because people would gather in front of the creation of these because it would give off tremendous vapors that were visible. And I became very curious about that. And so I started to walk around and ask these adults, what are you doing? Why is this so intriguing to you? And of course, what were they all doing? They were all holding up their phones like this. And so I started to have conversations with them because I'm curious. I kept saying, well, what are you going to do with this? And they said, well, of course, we're going to upload it to Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, etc. And what were they going to do? They were going to accompany it with their narrative. It wasn't, wow, liquid nitrogen is really, really interesting. What a cool phenomena. It was, here is my place in the narrative. So somehow we have to break this cycle of being in our echo chambers that resulted from, in my opinion, machine learning. Start to embrace other ideas and have that door open. I have to tell you, despite the fact that I sound relativistic to the point that was made in the chat, I am actually probably more positivistic. Like when I have conversations about what people believe is true, my off-the-cuff thinking is provide evidence. Can you show me something that I can see, taste, hear, smell, or feel that would support your position? And I don't criticize them if they can't, right? This is part of my dissertation work too. I know I'm all over the place, but one of the most important consequences of my dissertation work was this concept called reflexivity. So here's the danger, okay? So if we are scientists or we are artists or we are members of any epistemological community, the off-the-cuff response is to judge people as a consequence of coming from another epistemological community. Well, this concept called reflexivity is the idea that what people believe is true comes from the people that they hold most dearly. So imagine what happens if you're a kindergarten teacher and you meet a child and you say to them, what you think is true is not true. It's just not true. I'm sorry, but your mother and father and grandparents and those that you hold dearest, that you love most, they're full of it. They don't know what they're talking about. You have lost them for perpetuity. So my advice or my suggestion is the way that you enter into conversation is you first accept what the other person is talking about as counting as knowledge. And then as a consequence of the dialogue, you have the opportunity to challenge their thinking, to create that productive cognitive dissonance, where you can actually challenge them, treat them as a human being, treat them respectfully. Oh my gosh, the vitriol that I see in social media from, I don't even want to say sides. Sides is a misnomer. In our culture, we're convinced that things are binary. There is no binary position. I'll make one more connection, then I'll be quiet. That's a sweeping connection between lots and lots of things. Another very scholarly and important book was written called Imagine Communities. And Imagine Communities was by Benedict Anderson. And this is on most graduate study lists. But the book basically says, hey, you think you're a member of a democracy. You think that you're a Republican or a Democrat. You think that you're conservative or progressive. But in reality, if you look at it and you go down to a lower level of resolution, within each construct, you will find tremendous differences, right? This was why we brought race. You may have remembered this exhibit to Discovery Place. Any construct we use, there are differences. There are nuanced differences on a continuum, right? I'll stop there.
And no need to stop it. I think you've connected so many different things. One of the things you said brought me back to my dad. Yes, politically we are not aligned, but our values are very much aligned. So when we listen to each other and those differences start to fall away into the very universal things, and the things that are most core to us are the same. It's the how to get there that we believe in the differences, and we learn from each other. And my friend Kristen, at Davidson, they practice free inquiry, which I'm sure as a scientist you recognize, but it requires a personal challenge.
Oh, yes.
And that personal challenge is to be ever open and not resistant. And just what you said is that we come to conversations with each other in that experience, and we bring our knowledge, and we're not accepting of another as having knowledge, even though it is different, and using that as part of to inform the conversation.
I love that, Angela. So you're making me harken back to the other time that we had a talk when we did the Gathering of Minds. So I'm gonna interject a bit of biology and a bit of science here. Just imagine what the world were like if we were more like the mantis shrimp. So, okay, so I sound like an insane person. Why is the mantis shrimp extraordinary? It has the ability to see, I think, 16 different chroma, right? So we are kind of three. We see, red, what is it, RGB, red, green, blue. So just imagine if when you entered into a conversation, you entered into it sort of as an opportunity for unveiling, right? I'm not going to probe this person to see what their political beliefs are. Rather, I'm going to enter into it to see what might be unveiled that would be beneficial to me or interesting, or which I might carry with me, to include in my aspirations to become wise, right? In my endeavor to discover what is true. Imagine what difference there would be. So I'm going to sound like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth. So the tolerance to discover what somebody else knows is the first thing. There's the other part, the positivistic, judgmental part of me too. Stephen Jay Gould, I loved him. He was the former chair of the science department at Harvard. He wrote all of these wonderful natural history books, one of which is entitled The Flamingo Smile. And what he said was, science is a fruitful mode of inquiry. So in other words, if somebody makes a claim about what is true, there's not a way to test that claim, then it's not science. I'm not saying we have to judge them. It's just not science. All of these crazy conspiracy theories and all of the things that are in the currency of our current culture. I think about Stephen Jay Gould. Hey, okay, so we are being controlled by a laser from space. Okay, what evidence can you point to that would allow us to run a fair test, right? And I'm not, okay, you continue to believe that, but if we can't run a test for it, of what value is it, right? I could wake up every day and say, I see fairies in my garden, and I'm the only one that can see them. Okay, that very well may be true, but how do we enter into a dialogue about that if you're the only one that can see them and there's not something that we can do to test that? So he wrote this fabulous article called Sex, Drugs, Disasters, and the Extinction of Dinosaurs. There was actually this theory. It was an idea. It actually had traction, where there was a group of scientists who believed that dinosaurs went extinct because it got too warm. And, we all know, by the way, not to be profane, but why do the reproductive organs of males exist outside of the body of mammals? It's because we need to regulate temperature, right? The sperm count needs to remain cool. The reproductive organs need to remain cool in order to have viable sperm, right? So Stephen Jay Gould says, okay, great. So how many of you have a fossil of a Tyrannosaurus Rex testicle? Yeah, nobody does. It's a soft tissue. So what then can we do? And believe it or not, I love it. There was actually these poor graduate students. There were graduate students in the University of Florida who were asked to actually take the test of alligator testicles, right? So the closest possible living lineage, of course, was alligators and crocodiles. So imagine taking a hypodermic needle. What a fun job, into an alligator, right? So the point being, there's nothing that we can test. The other one was drugs, right? So it turns out that dinosaurs went extinct in a time that was simultaneous to the emergence of angiosperms. Angiosperms are the flowers that are responsible for the narcotics that give us experiences, out of body experiences, etc. Right? So, in other words, there were people who were saying dinosaurs ate angiosperm and they got so high that they died, right? Which is absolutely insane too. Again, do you have a dinosaur stomach on your bookshelf, or a means by which we could make dinosaurs take, narcotic drugs? Now he talks about the last one, which is the Alvarez hypothesis, which says an asteroid hit the Earth. Can you point to something concrete? We can. There's actually an iridium layer that goes around the entire Earth, which is in layers at the Cretaceous boundary when dinosaurs went extinct. And so we actually have evidence. So anyway, I will stop. Again, Robert going down a rabbit hole.
I love the rabbit hole. The rabbit hole is all to a good end. And it just brought me back to, we started with a premise that people actually want to know the truth.
Yeah.
And you actually have to have that desire, or some desire, to be open to the truth. Otherwise, we'll continue to feed our own dialogue, right? So you said something in our last talk that we live in an in-between universe. And
Yeah.
I want to make sure that we kind of get to that, because I was a little bit fascinated by your thoughts on that.
Right. So just to comment very quickly on your prior statement, seeking truth is uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. It can be painful, right? To borrow from a popular example, which pill would you take in the Matrix? there is the tendency and the desire to be comfortable, right? I will make this statement and say very quickly, this is a critique of Americans, including myself. Honestly, I am just as guilty. I don't want to be a hypocrite. I'm just as guilty of this at times. If I am faced with the opportunity to be comfortable rather than to secure what is true, I might have the tendency to choose what is comfortable. And that has become, in my opinion, an existential threat to our culture and to our society. Okay, so the in-between universe thing, some of you may remember the old Cosmos series, right? I love the old Cosmos series because, oh my gosh, what's his name? Carl
Sagan?
Sagan, thank you. Oh my gosh, Sagan escaped. Carl Sagan said in one of the really early episodes about the history of science, where he's talking about Kepler and Galileo and so forth, he goes into this narrative where he says, thank goodness we live in an in-between universe where there are things that we can't predict and there are things that we can. And it's in between, right? So we don't really know what's going to happen to us day to day. Oh my gosh, particularly in Charlotte traffic. My goodness, it's become crazy, right? You just don't know what's going to happen. But you kind of know what's going to happen. You kind of know that people are going to stop at stop signs generally. They're going to stop at traffic lights and so forth. Just imagine how awful the universe would be if we could predict everything. It's a continuum again, right? We don't want to be so far in the continuum that it's utterly unpredictable, on one end, and we don't want to be on the other end of the continuum where it's the same routine day after day after day. That's the beauty of wonder in science and curiosity, is we can be in that in-between place. And that is again, I mean, we're really talking about a synonym for cognitive dissonance again. We know some things, but we can be challenged to actually think about whether those things are true. I am apologetic again. I want to talk about how we can challenge ourselves, to embrace that ambiguity and embrace the not knowing.
Yeah.
Jonah Lehrer wrote this extraordinary book called Proust Was a Neuroscientist. And he wrote another book called Imagine. Both these books make the case that artists actually made discoveries in neuroscience prior to scientists. You think about the Impressionists. What is impressionistic artwork? It is really creating an image on the basis of individual pieces of light, right? Packets of light. And it turns out that's the way we process information, neurologically speaking, is it comes in as packets of light, and then we process it and create images, right? So he also articulates this really important coefficient called Q value. And this is so important. So this is a coefficient that is usually used in social science circles, sociology primarily. In a nutshell, what it says is the more you embrace different epistemological communities, invite people in that think differently from you, the more often you do that, the more often you are likely to have a truly creative, innovative solution. So it's articulated as Q value. So in other words, and by the way, there are I assume all of you work in departments. You are leaders in departments, or you might be in college departments, or you might be in a K-12 department, or you might work within an organization. Well, there is an existential threat if you have the same people who think the same way, and you only interact with those people. We see it acutely in what has happened through our political elections, but you also see it in organizations. This is why I love Teach for America, by the way. Educators, some of them don't love Teach for America people because they're young and have been apprised of the most recent thinking in the field of education, and they tend to come in very, very ambitious and idealistic, and they want to shake things up. I invited people like that into my departments at Discovery Place, because the more people that you invite in that have a differing point of view, the more rigorous and innovative you will be. I'll stop there. I was getting ready to talk about the adjacent possible, but I'll pause because I don't want to make you all pass out with boredom.
No one's bored, I promise. I think there's somebody who wants to jump in conversation with you.
Yes, although I do want to return to the adjacent possible, which is my favorite
Yes.
thing ever. But yeah, we have Tim McCleary has a comment about truth decay, and I'm going to turn it over to him.
Great, thanks, Kristen. Robert, this is fascinating. I recently read an article on truth decay from Rand Corporation, and I don't want to put you on the spot. I don't have a huge depth of knowledge in this. The one thing that really struck me about truth decay is it feels like it's only happening now. And what I learned is this is cyclical, and it's been happening over and over and again at points in our history. And there are ways we've overcome it in society. So I'm curious if you have some thoughts on what it might take, where we might be in the cycle right now, and what it might take to overcome it when it feels like we're in the thick of it and there isn't a way out.
Oh my gosh, that's such a great observation. And I love that you are, by the way, I love that this conversation is non-Cartesian, right? That we're not having conversations just about science in buckets isolated from everything else, because that's just not the reality of the world. And by the way, we owe it to our students and to our colleagues to depict and discuss the complexity of the world, right? The science of complexity. So I just need to comment on your observation. Radiolab is such a fantastic podcast. I cannot tell you the specific episode, but the point was made in this episode that we have gone through cycles of extreme skepticism to the edge of nihilism to having rebirth, right? Going through essentially, you know, we tend, because we are generally speaking Western thinkers, to think the Enlightenment, you know, only began in the 1200s and the 1300s, but it actually has happened. It's ubiquitous. It has happened in many, many other cultures. It's happening all the time. There is an analogy, of course, to scientific revolutions. This thinking, which is sort of like, I would call it transformative thinking or revolutionary thinking, always lives beside the prevailing dominant thinking. And it emerges and it enters and it leaves and it goes through cycles. And so it is not linear at all. I am going to be a little hopeful here and say that we are going to come out of the truth decay as a consequence of the things that are going to happen. Whether you buy the narratives that are emanating from what happened on January 6th or not, to me, it's kind of irrelevant. What matters is those narratives are in your head. And now we have a starting off point where we can have a conversation. Whether you are, in one binary position or another, you are at least experiencing cognitive dissonance because you have the wherewithal to talk to others about it. So at least we can enter in. By the way, so I love the biological analogy too that is in that Radiolab episode where they talk about, I'm not suggesting any of us are going to do this, but they talk about lemmings, right? I have yet to hear a scientific explanation that is adequate for why lemmings jump off a cliff. But there have been examples where we have had, mass suicide or mass nihilism in civilization. So I don't even know if I answer your question other than to say, I believe that there is hope. I don't want to tip my hand at all, but when we saw the changes that we have all seen recently, I was definitely brought to tears in terms of the willingness to entertain ideas, significant shifts towards empathy, et cetera. I think is part of the answer to that. I think re-embracing empathy and considering the experiences of others is the way that we deal with truth decay. That's a great question. By the way, I'm a very curious person. I'd love to read the article and or the source of that construct called truth decay. I need to learn more about that.
Will you send that to us, Tim? Awesome.
Tim,
Great.
thank you.
Yes, thank you. So I'm going to let Kristen really wanted to hear what you were going to say next.
Oh, were you talking about the adjacent possible?
Yes, the adjacent.
Okay, so those that are not familiar with Stephen Johnson's work, here's another, by the way, potential answer to the prior question about truth decay. Stephen Johnson basically talks about this. You can help me, Kristen. He talks about the adjacent possible. So let me just make this claim. What we are able to conceive is determined by what we perceive. That's not wholly true, but for the majority of us, We have to be able to actually see, taste, hear, smell, feel something in order to imagine its purpose or to imagine what is next. So Stephen Johnson articulates this construct called the adjacent possible, which is essentially, I call it a fuzzy place of possibility. So, let me give you an example. As a consequence of Twitter and Facebook, we were able to imagine all of these other social applications and these other disruptive innovations like Instacart and Uber and so forth. But we couldn't have imagined that if we hadn't first been presented with the adjacent possible, right? This has happened. Now that I have this, that I can perceive, now I can conceive other possibilities. There is an equivalent, by the way, in education circles to the work of Lev Vygotsky, where he talks about the zone of proximal development. The zone of proximal development means to present concepts or ideas that are within reach of a person, but you have to stretch a little bit, right? You have to present it in that way. By the way, this is another way we might deal with truth decay, and the echo chamber is enter into conversations where you're at the zone of proximal development. If you're entering into a dialogue with somebody, for example, that doesn't have a positivistic understanding or the principles or theory of science, you can't immediately attack them and call them deplorable, right? You have to enter into a conversation, as I said before, using reflexivity, where what they think is knowledge counts as knowledge, and then through discourse, you have the opportunity perhaps to move the conversation forward. By the way, I'm sounding arrogant as if I am the one to impart the knowledge. You have to be open to the opportunity to learn from them as well, right? So Angela, your father, I have no doubt, has some wisdom to impart. So anyway, that is my
arrogant, Robert, is never something I would associate with you. So continue on.
So anyway, Kristen, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Did I somewhat accurately represent the adjacent possible?
Yes, I think so. I think of it in the context of innovation, which is where I work. So it's Stephen Johnson calls it the shadow future that's always hovering, adjacent to what you're working on now. But the way we think about it is, how do we understand what's possible in the present? So what's our evolutionary potential of the present that we can begin to work toward? And as you open one of those adjacent possible doors, 6 more doors open that you couldn't have predicted. And it's this amazing process. And I don't want to stop the conversation, but we do have someone ready to come on stage. Ty Schaefer, if we could bring Ty on stage.
Yeah, thanks. I hope y'all can hear me okay. I'd like to hear Dr. Corbin talk a bit about the characteristics of a society that values truth and the search for truth, what that looks like. And I asked that kind of playing off of the discussion of truth decay, because it strikes me that we may confuse periods where there was consensus with periods where we valued truth properly understood.
Yes, so that is a brilliant question. I love that. So, by the way, I just have to say something about scientific habits of mind. Science as an endeavor has never claimed to embark upon this pathway to truth. All science ever does and says is we can gather evidence to support the probability that something is true. And so I would say one of the primary characteristics of a society that is open to the pursuit of truth is accepting the possibility that you can be wrong, and accepting the possibility, right? I don't want to go into really, really boring statistics, but why do we calculate p-values? Why do we do ANOVA? Because we are getting closer and closer approximations to what is true through statistics, with the idea that we are accepting that we will never quite get there. By the way, I don't want to turn anybody off, but this is really the province of calculus too. Right? Why do we calculate the area under the curve? So that we can get closer and closer and closer and closer approximations of truth, understanding the infinite that we will never get to that ultimate truth. It is a lifelong aspiration. And so I would say we have got to create that tolerance for other narratives. We have to be open to the possibility, as much as those narratives may irritate us, we have to at least consider the narratives and enter into dialogue. So I will say, Ty, I am a socio-transformative constructivist. Say that 3 times fast. So it means that I kind of know through experience that the very best learning is that which happens through discourse, right? So this is Brunner and Piaget and Vygotsky, and it's really the Socratic method. It really is Socrates himself. So the attributes of a society that endeavor to discover truth are those that are willing to and support the efforts to enter into Socratic dialogue. All right, so this is a sidebar, and I have to mention it. And this is in honor of Dr. Bosley and those that have a more lyrical view of the world. I have a lyrical view of the world as well. I have to say, one of the most profound entries in Western literature, in my opinion, is I Sing the Body Electric by Whitman. Because Whitman makes this profound point, this profound and important point, that we cannot distinguish what we feel from what we think, right? What we feel and what we think, our minds, bodies, and souls are one. When we go out into the world and we touch something, it impacts how we think. When we think something, it impacts how we feel. I know that science teaches us that we have to tamp down how we feel. I'm not yet convinced of that. I am not yet convinced that truth only comes by complete 100% objectivity. And I am aware of the threats of relativism, but I don't think we can enter into sufficient dialogue in our current culture without also recognizing, acknowledging the way that a person feels. So yeah, we derive truth from all of those.
Well, you just touched on something as a burning question in my mind for you was, so when I have my event planning hat on and we're in the design process for something and we're trying to design this atmosphere that says something with all the nuances we want it to say, when we hit that nail on the head, I feel it somewhere that is not my intellect. I can't describe it except that I know. And there is an absolute truth to it that I know that that is it. Whether it comes out that way because we're doing it for clients doesn't always happen, but I know what it is. What is that and what's the value in that?
Oh my gosh, so I have to start off by saying, okay, so I'm hoping I'm not putting myself at risk. I hope this is an open dialogue and that you won't judge me by responding to this. But
You're in a place of love, Robert. Carry on.
I'm speaking to both the ladies and the men in the room. All right, so I want to go back and well, let me give you a précis and say I'm a big time STEMinist, right? I am the word STEMinist means I'm very deeply concerned about how we help girls to enter into science, technology, and math, right? So that's not a mispronunciation. And again, it goes to Q value and it goes to the more diverse a group solving a problem, the more innovative the solution. Colleagues that are men, we have a great deal to learn about empathy from ladies, in my opinion. I'd like to see more of them ascend to leadership positions. I think that is actually happening, and I think it is part of the answer to truth decay in our culture. And I don't know those that are married to ladies, whether you have had this experience, but your wives and girlfriends and significant ladies in your life, they know things that I personally have a difficult time understanding, but they turn out to be true. And I can't point to the evidence, what we touch, taste, hear, smell, and feel that would indicate that it is true, but it is true. I have to give you another example, men, along the lines of the mantis shrimp. I don't know if you all know this, but ladies actually have the ability to identify through superchroma. Men, you only have 3. You only see a differentiation of colors in terms of 3 channels. Ladies have the ability to see through an additional channel, which is find nuanced differences in reds and oranges, right? So, so now I'm going to admit, I am now at the place that I criticized before. I'm in the fairies in the garden place, right? I don't have evidence to support this claim. I only know it is true. And so there's an important lesson to be learned here. We have all these people that subscribe to conspiracy theories. I don't have evidence to point that it is true. I just know that it's true.
Hmm.
So it's human nature, even those of us that are very, very systematic about our thinking, we all have examples that we can point to where it is true, but we don't have evidence to support that it's true.
Got it. So we are at 12:52. Robert has generously agreed to stay with us until 1 o'clock. But I do think that we have one more person, Kristen, that wants to come on stage and engage.
We do. And in the spirit of women who know, let's bring, can we bring Barbara Randolph up?
Let's do. Hi, Barbara.
Am I unmuted?
No, you're good. Yes.
Oh, great. Okay. So this was, this popped into my head when Dr. Corbin responded to, and I apologize to the individual who asked a question about truth decay. And he was very optimistic in his response, but what's swimming in my head was my concern about the fact that, how can we truly have aspirations for truth and openness when capitalistic tendencies and private interests will always drive the suppression of information, misinformation purposefully. And that's a wall that we're never going to get away from.
It's such a brilliant question again. So I think about this. What was the story of the person who checked out of society and went and lived in a bus into the wild, right? Mm. So there is a level of discomfort when we choose to live the ascetic life, when we choose to reject all things that are material. My answer would be, I think we can go to an in-between place. By the way, we all know Thoreau, Walden. Yes, he lived in a cabin in the woods, but he also had access to suburbia. And so he engaged with material things and material comforts and so forth. I would say that intellectually, we do need to go through that exercise where we reject that capitalism can answer some of the most vexing problems in the world. It can't. We cannot solve, in my opinion, the issue of climate through capitalism. We cannot solve the issue of biodiversity loss through capitalism, because the more scarce a resource becomes, the higher its value, which is then impetus to, use more and more of those resources. So I think you've actually pointed to the answer somewhat, Barbara, in my opinion, is that intellectually, cognitively, we have to reject capitalism. So when I used to teach students in a course at Duke University, which was, believe it or not, it was a disaster science course, I pushed kids to think about, how do we actually measure our well-being, right? GDP is not it. I don't go to bed at night and say, oh my gosh, I'm feeling really, really good because my stocks went up by 2%, right? I don't impose that upon my children either. We can't impose responsibility to earn over fun, right? Or wonder, or inspiration, or relationship, or empathy, or discourse. Those things are more important. So I would say you have partially answered the question. So there are other measures, like there's a gross happiness index, that if you haven't heard of this, I would love for you to take a look at it. It is an alternative narrative. Here we go, Thomas Kuhn again. Here's another narrative that's running a line along the dominant culture's narrative about GDP. There is I know I'm all over, but there's another fantastic book called Factfulness. Factfulness was written by I think he was a Finn statistician. He worked for Doctors Without Borders, and he had the benefit of traveling all over the world and interacting with communities and trying to figure out how he could be of service to those communities. And what he learned was, we have got to start to come to agreement on what is true about cultures and about all these constructs that we use to reach a conclusion about the well-being of a society. So what are the constructs? literacy among women, extent to which people are ascending from poverty. You know, do people have access to material goods? So he wrote this wonderful book called Factfulness, which sort of corroborates my thoughts about things being on continua. We still think in our culture about the developed world, the in-between and the developing world, when in fact there are multiple iterations on a continuum. The same thing about fresh water, the same thing about toilets, the same thing about what we want as material good, the same thing about education, the same thing about pregnancy rates. They exist on continua. So to wrap it up, reject capitalism intellectually, right? And I would say embrace the science of complexity, embrace that all of the constructs that we think about really exist on continua, is part of the path there, in my humble opinion.
Thank you so much, Robert. Thank you, Barbara, for that question. We're at 12:58 and I'm so sad. An hour is never enough with Robert, but gosh, Robert, thank you so much. I really can't thank you enough for that.
It's a
We're-
privilege.
It's been a very valuable conversation to me. We hope it has been to you. And I want to say that if you all will keep a lookout, we'll have another, we'll have our first forum event in March, and that's March 24th. So look out for that invitation. And we will reach out to you all with some attempt at pulling some of the great things out of this conversation and feeding them back to you. If anyone has anything else to share in the chat, please do. We will use those as our takeaways. And thank you again. Thank you all for being here. And Robert, thanks again, my friend.
An honor. Thank you all for listening to my nattering on. You are very gracious and polite, and look forward to interacting with you as a participant in the future events. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Take care. Be well.
You as well.